Thank you all for coming. My name is Elaine Leader, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences. For those of you who are here because of my class, be sure to sign in at the back. And I'd like to invite President Ruben Armiñana to welcome you to this wonderful talk.
I am not in her class, but I did sign in. First, let me welcome all of you to the Andrea Neves and Bart Evans lecture on social justice. Later on, you're going to meet the actual Andrea Neves, who will formally introduce our speaker. But I'm very pleased that all of you are here. I think we're going to listen to some very interesting remarks. Since Andrea is going to introduce Professor Guinier, I just wanted to make note of one thing, because I found it highly remarkable. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. But in reading about Professor Guinier, he says that by the age of 4, she was sure she wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And I have to tell you, at the age of 4, I did not know what toy I wanted to have or not. Therefore, I found that remarkable and a great level of commitment to a career about writing, speaking, and thinking about issues of diversity, issues of social justice, and issues of the proper rules and how you make rules work, and if not, how to change those rules. And we're delighted to have you all here. I think you are in for very interesting remarks that will make you think. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be real quick. I just want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank Andrea Neves and Barton Evans, who sponsored through a wonderful endowment the Social Justice Lecture Series, of which this is the second lecture. Last year, some of you were here for Jonathan Kozol and now Dr. Lani Guinier. And so we are really having some illustrious public speakers and having a dialogue of public interest. So it's quite exciting. I'd like to thank a few people, particularly the Instructional Related Activities Fund, which co-sponsored this, Bruce Berkowitz of the Associated Students, Bonnie Sugiyama from the Center of Culture, Gender, and Sexuality, Mary Gendernalik Cooper, who is the Dean of the School of Education, with whom this is also co-sponsored, and my wonderful assistant, Connie Lusader, without whom none of my events could ever come off. So I want to thank her. I'd like to I'd like to tell you about Dr. Neves. This is as a result of her generous gift. She was an esteemed professor in the School of Education for 33 years. And really gave wonderful service to the university. But then when she left, she decided that she wanted to leave a lasting legacy that we would be able to remember and engage in public discourse. And so it's very exciting that we have this kind of an event here on this campus. I don't think all of us are quite aware of just how wonderful this is, so hopefully you'll get turned on by what you're going to be experiencing tonight. I'd like to introduce Dr. Neves, who will tell us about Lani Guinier.
Thank you, Elaine. See all these pages? These are all Googled pages that I tried to glean some information about Lani Guinier from. And it was quite a task because she is so well known and she's done so many marvelous things, and her writings have had such an profound effect on so many people and so many lives. It was very hard for me to kind of glean from all these pages, and I think she was somewhat traumatized, as was everyone else tonight when I showed them. I said, "You're not going to read all this, are you?" I said, "No, not at all." When our committee met to go over possible speakers for this lecture series, Lani's name came up right away. Because of her profound sense of social justice that runs through all of her writings, all of her speaking and lectures, and her active life. She's a very coherent, cohesive, well-centered person whose passion for social justice can be seen in just about everything she does. Her life has been very interesting. She's from New York, and she presently is the Bennett Bosky Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. She's the first woman of African descent to be tenured at the law school. So this is a task in itself. Before coming to Harvard, she was 10 years at the University of Pennsylvania. Did I get that correctly? Was it University of Pennsylvania? She first came into probably the first time I think we meaning the people in the United States, heard of Lani was during the Clinton administration. And I'm just mentioning this because her writing on this, on voting rights, I think is very enlightening. It certainly is well within our founding fathers' frame of cautioning about the tyranny of the majority over the minority. Clinton administration, William Clinton appointed her, or was about to appoint her. I don't know exactly how, well, I know how it ended up, but I don't know what the process was. Appointed her to be the head the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And that met with a storm of criticism that was unfounded by right-wing press and others who misinterpreted just about all of her writing, from what I can see, which was very enlightened, and what she was advocating, for the most part, was nothing more than what so many of our other European countries advocate: proportional representation or cumulative voting. Anyway, I just had to say that because this is, if you mention Lani's name in certain contexts, this comes up. Oh, wasn't there something about her writing in those days that led people to, or at least Clinton, to take back the nomination? She has written 5 books, including The Miner's Canary, where issues of race and social class and equity are centerpiece. She's also written a 4th book called Qualified, Who's Qualified? It discusses new ways of dealing with issues of diversity. She's had numerous awards, and well, I could go and read them, but I don't think I'm going to, because the more I talk, the less she talks. So please, let's welcome Lani Guinier.
Probably seems inappropriate to correct the record, since the record has been thus far very favorable, but I was not 4, I was 12. On the other hand, my son was 4 when he gave me the metaphor for the ideas that had gotten me into so much trouble when Bill Clinton had nominated me. My son and I were reading a Sesame Street magazine, and the magazine was trying to teach children about voting, and the exercise involved a page in which you saw 6 kids trying to decide whether to play hide and seek or tag, and 4 of the kids had their hands raised because they wanted to play tag, and 2 of the kids did not raise their hands because they wanted to play hide and seek. And the magazine had a big headline, "Vote!" exclamation point, and then the question, what game will the children play? Count the number of kids who want to play tag, 4. Count the number who want to play hide and seek, 2. What game will the children play? And my son answered, well, they'll play both. First they'll play tag, and then they'll play hide and seek. And that was the metaphor for the ideas that then got me into so much trouble in 1993. So he was 4 at the time, but when I decided that I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, I was watching Constance Baker Motley, who was escorting James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. He was trying to desegregate the institution, and Constance Baker Motley was a tall, very dignified black woman escorting James Meredith, a young, motivated black man, and they were the only two black people that I saw in the television footage, because the rest of the people on the screen were whites at the University of Mississippi who were angry to see James Meredith gracing their doorstep. And I remember thinking that Constance Baker Motley's posture was so erect and her manner of carrying herself was so dignified that that was something that I aspired to be able to do. In the face of a jeering mob, to be able to stand tall. Little did I know that in 1993 I would be in the face of a jeering mob, and it was very hard to stand tall. But I did get some pretty good advice as a result of that experience. It was a humiliating experience. People made fun, not so much of my ideas, and in fact, if we had had a discussion about my ideas, that would have been fine. But they made fun of my hair and of my name. I was called Loony Lani, Real America's Mad Woman. I won't go on with all of the terminology, but Roger Wilkins, who was a friend of mine and also a professor at George Mason University, basically gave me the advice that ultimately resonated with my image of Constance Baker Motley back when she was the lawyer representing James Meredith. He said, "Lani, Americans don't like victims. So even though you feel humiliated by this experience where you have been essentially jeered by a howling mob of press people and conservative pundits, you have to think of yourself as a woman with a cause, not a grievance. A cause, not a grievance." And in some ways, that is the theme of my talk tonight. How can we see the issues of race and gender, the issues of people who've been marginalized or underrepresented, as a cause, not a grievance, as a source of information about a larger set of problems that is ultimately affecting all of us, rather than a claim on behalf of people who feel that they've been victimized or treated unfairly, in which the appeal is essentially for our sympathy rather than for our collective action. And the metaphor that I would like to use for this idea of thinking about the issues of race and gender, in particular as a cause, not a grievance, is the metaphor of the miner's canary, which is the title of the book that Gerald Torres and I co-authored. And the miners used to take a canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the miners. And this was obviously before the advent of the gas mask or any of the other technology that sometimes works in the 21st century. And the canary, little yellow, fragile bird, had a weak respiratory system, and when the canary started to gasp for breath, that was a signal to the miners that they needed to evacuate the mines. And the argument that Gerald Torres and I make in summoning this metaphor is that the experience of those who've been left out, the experience of those who've been underrepresented, the experience of those who've been marginalized is like the experience of the canary. That is, oftentimes problems converge around those in our society who are the most vulnerable. And we can see those problems when those who are the most vulnerable are also highly visible. But we make a mistake if we think that the fact that we see problems associated with people of color or associated with women, we make a mistake if we think that those problems are located in the people of color or in the women, because like the canary in the mines, they are a diagnostic tool. They are telegraphing to us problems that are actually affecting all of us, but that we otherwise don't see. And so it's the move from thinking about the canary as the victim of the toxic atmosphere in the mines to thinking about the canary in many ways as a signal, as a means of alerting us to larger problems that are affecting all of us. That I would like to talk this evening about issues of affirmative action and access to higher education, using the metaphor again of the miner's canary. So when we think about affirmative action, when we think about access to higher education, we think about diversity, we think about people of color. In particular, we think about blacks. Sometimes we may also think about Latinos, but often the stereotype, or at least the signal, is of a black student applying to an institution of higher education with quote-unquote weaker academic credentials and therefore less deserving of admission, and therefore in many ways representing a departure from our commitment to a meritocracy. So the way in which we think about affirmative action is that there is a contrast, a challenge, a tension, a conflict between our commitment to merit and our commitment to diversity. And those who represent diversity are the people with, quote, less merit, and therefore we have to justify in some way giving them the opportunity to participate in higher education such that we can justify not following our meritocratic standards or commitments. And I want to suggest that, in fact, diversity and the issue of opening up our institutions of higher education is not a threat to the meritocracy, but in fact is a way of illuminating the fact that the meritocracy itself is built on a house of cards, that the meritocracy and the claims that we are making about merit are actually claims that, if you take them apart, are really about defending access to higher education as well as to other scarce public resources in the name of merit, but they are actually going to people based on wealth and privilege. So we have a system of reproducing privilege, giving opportunities to people who are already quite well-to-do, calling it merit, and then when we, excuse me, can't lose those glasses, calling it merit, and then when we see that our terminology of merit is not being inclusive, and therefore we have to use other measures to ensure that people of color have access, we say, well, that's diversity and it is a departure from merit. But in fact, my argument is that the experience of the Canaries, women and people of color, is the experience of a critique of the meritocracy itself in ways that not only ultimately may benefit women or people of color, but in ways, if we follow this critique to its logical conclusion, will open up institutions of higher education to working class and poor whites, rural whites as well. So let me give you a very concrete example of what I'm talking about, just to start in a way that perhaps is less abstract. In Texas, as in California, there is a set of public institutions, and in particular, in Texas, there are the flagship public institutions, which are considered the most selective and the most elite. And if you want to become a leader in Texas, there's a lot of pressure to go to the University of Texas in Austin or Texas A&M. Now, Cheryl Hopwood, a white working class mother, she was the mother of a disabled youngster. She was a single mom. She was eager to go to the University of Texas Law School, and she applied and did not get in. And her assumption immediately was that she did not get in because less qualified blacks and Latinos had somehow taken her place. She was convinced that her LSAT scores, which are the equivalent of the SAT or the ACT, but to get into law school, she was convinced that her LSAT scores were high enough that she should have gotten into the University of Texas in Austin, and that blacks and Latinos with lower LSAT scores had nevertheless been admitted, and so she filed a lawsuit. And at the time, this was before the Supreme Court had ruled on affirmative action in the Michigan cases. At the time, the federal court, the Fifth Circuit, ruled in her favor and said that whatever the University of Texas was doing that was race conscious to diversify its applicant pool as well as its admittees was unconstitutional. Now, this left the University of Texas administrators, as well as the blacks and Latinos in the legislature in Texas, in a bind, because Texas was a state, part of the Deep South, that had officially practiced Jim Crow, had not allowed blacks to attend its public institutions, and was the site of a Supreme Court case in 1950 in which a black man who was trying to practice law, was trying to go to law school, was told that he would not be allowed to attend the University of Texas because he was black, but he could sit in a separate room and take classes as long as his white peers did not have to look at him or realize that he was participating in their collective study. So Texas has a history of official discrimination, and the Fifth Circuit in the Hopwood case was basically telling them they could not do anything to remediate that history because that would be reverse discrimination and would be discriminating against people like Cheryl Hopwood. But the key issue here is who was doing well on the LSAT. Cheryl Hopwood was suggesting that she had done well, and that entitled her to admission to the University of Texas in Austin, the law school, and that blacks and Latinos were not doing as well on the LSAT. But now think about my metaphor, the canary in the mines. If we think about the blacks and Latinos as the canary, then we have to use their experience, in fact, of not doing as well on the LSAT, not as the basis for pathologizing them, but as the basis for opening up a deeper look at the way in which the University of Texas Law School was admitting everybody. And that's the move that a group of Canary watchers in Texas actually made. And what they discovered is that Cheryl Hopwood did not get into the University of Texas because she had gone to a state and a community college, not because of affirmative action. Now you wonder, wait a second. Turns out that the University of Texas Law School, as do many law schools, was using a formula for determining who would be eligible for admission. And the formula included the individual LSAT score of the applicant, the undergraduate GPA of the applicant, but then also included a third factor, which was the median LSAT score of all of the students who had taken the LSAT from your graduating class. So then you say, well, why would that have adversely affected Cheryl Hopwood? I gave you the answer. Because she had gone to a state college, first a community college, then a state college. Well, what does that have to do with the median LSAT score? It turns out, on the one hand, it is true. With LSAT, ACT, SAT, blacks and Latinos do not score as high as whites. But it is also true that within each race and ethnic group, as your parental income goes up, so do your SAT scores. Okay, you're still not sure, well, what does this have to do with a state or community college? Well, it turns out that the people who go to state or community colleges are less well-to-do than the people who go to private institutions. In fact, Tony Carnevale did a study of the 146 most selective institutions in the country and found that of those institutions, a disproportionate number of which are private institutions. 75% of the students were people who came from the top 25% of the social, economic status indicators in this society. So if you were among those who were the most wealthy, you were among those most likely to go to the most selective schools in this society. At those same 146 institutions, only 3% of the students came from families where the income and other socioeconomic indicators was consistent with the bottom 25% of our population. Only 10% of the students at the most selective institutions came from the bottom half of the social and economic status indicators. The Canary Watchers in Texas, looking at the University of Texas, now we're talking about the college, not the law school, found a very similar set of phenomena. There are 1,500 high schools in Texas. At the time that Cheryl Hopwood brought her lawsuit, 150 of those high schools were dominating the freshman class. Students from 150 of those high schools were dominating the freshman class at the University of Texas in Austin. So of the 1,500 high schools, 10% of the high schools represented 75% of the freshmen at the University of Texas in Austin. Now, we're talking at the University of Texas about a public institution. This is an institution that is funded by all of the taxpayers of Texas. It is an institution that gets lots of federal subsidies, as do all institutions of higher education. They get federal subsidies not only for the research of their faculty, but also for the loans and scholarships for students. All institutions of higher education do not pay property taxes, nor do they pay income on the, nor do they pay taxes on the income from their endowments. So all institutions of higher education, in part, have a social compact, a contract, a deal, in which they are getting subsidy from the public, and in exchange, they are expected to be educating a representative group of future leaders. They are training citizens who are going to be serving our democracy. They are producing knowledge so that our country and the people in it can benefit from innovation and from research. They are serving society, producing knowledge, and training leaders. That's supposedly their part of the bargain, and in exchange they're getting these subsidies as well as tremendous autonomy. Even though the federal government, the state government gives a lot of money to these schools, not as much as it used to, and that's another part of the Canary story, which I will get to. They give a lot of money, but they don't have as much oversight, particularly the state, in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the teaching, as they do, for example, in K through 12 education. But it turns out that the University of Texas was defaulting on this pact, defaulting on this contract, defaulting on this deal, because they were not educating or training a representative group of future leaders. They were essentially using criteria that were privileging people who were already quite wealthy, and they were not demanding that the people who came to the University of Texas give back or serve their community in any particular way. They were treating merit as if it were a private reward, as opposed to a public resource. Now, you're still wondering, what does this have to do with Cheryl Hopwood not being able to get into the University of Texas Law School based on the median LSAT score of the people who went to her college? Well, it turns out that the state school that she went to had a student body that was actually much more diverse than the University of Texas, much more diverse not just by race, but particularly by class. And because of the relationship between these test scores and class, Cheryl Hopwood's equation, her formula, her presentation was pulled down because of the school that she had attended, because the relationship between LSAT and class is stronger than the relationship between LSAT and future performance. So these tests that we are calling merit are actually tests that are telling us about wealth. If you know someone's LSAT score, you are better able to predict their grandparents' wealth than you can their first-year grades in law school. Some people call this the Volvo effect. If you know someone's LSAT score, you can figure out the car that their parents drive. Now, you may wonder, what does this have to do then with what was happening at the University of Texas in the college? Same thing. The SAT was being used as a measure of merit, but it was the equivalent of asking students to submit their parents' tax returns and using that as an admissions criteria. Not as a criteria to determine whether they should get financial aid, but as a criteria to determine whether they were meritorious. Because that's the connection that we are basically making. Jesse Rothstein did a study of about 22,000 California high school students and looked at their first-year grades in college, looked at their background variables, and determined that the SAT scores of these students were essentially irrelevant if you wanted to know what they did when they were freshmen in college compared to what they had done as high school seniors. The key variable was family background. Family background was the greatest predictor of freshman college grades, not SAT scores. And yet, when you think about this idea of prediction, why are we so committed to figuring out who's going to do well freshman year in college? If the key variable is, well, you want to know who's going to do well in freshman year, look for the people who are the most wealthy. You don't want to say we're looking for the people who are most wealthy, so we'll therefore say we're looking for the people with the highest SAT scores. But my question is, why is it that our concern is with freshman grades? Why aren't we stepping back and asking, what is the mission of this institution? And is the institution using its admissions processes to further that mission? So in the context of Sonoma State, I went and looked at your mission statement. And I was very interested to find out, at least according to the web, the mission of Sonoma State University is to prepare students to be learned men and women who have a foundation for lifelong learning, have a broad cultural perspective, have a keen appreciation of intellectual and aesthetic achievements, will be active citizens and leaders in society, are capable of pursuing fulfilling careers in a changing world, and are concerned with contributing to the health and well-being of the world at large. There are three parts of this mission statement that I want to emphasize. One, a foundation for lifelong learning. Not what are your grades as freshmen, but do you have a foundation for lifelong learning? Are you going to continue to learn and to learn how to learn even after you graduate? The second element of this mission that I find very important is we'll be active citizens and leaders in society. Your freshman college grades do not tell us whether you're going to be active leaders and citizens in society, nor do your SAT scores. And the third, are concerned with contributing to the health and well-being of the world at large. And here I would say your SAT scores are probably a negative indicator with regard to being concerned about the health and well-being of the world at large. Now, why do I say that? Well, let me suggest that it is true based on a study that the University of Michigan did of its graduates over a 30-year period. And this, again, was a law school, and they were using the LSAT. And they were looking at the entry-level credentials of their alumni and comparing it to what their alumni had done after graduation. And they found that there was no relationship between the entry-level credentials and the three things that the University of Michigan valued in terms of its mission for its graduates. One was financial satisfaction. The second was career satisfaction, and the third was contribution to the community. When they looked at the entry-level credentials, again, no relationship between those with the highest LSAT scores and financial satisfaction. If you went to the University of Michigan Law School and graduated and practiced law, you were going to do well financially. And it didn't matter what your initial LSAT scores were. They found that there was a, again, statistically insignificant relationship between high entry-level credentials and career satisfaction. I say statistically insignificant because it actually was a negative relationship, meaning the people with the highest entry-level credentials were among those least likely to enjoy their careers. And one of the theories of the researchers is that people who do well on tests, such as the SAT or the LSAT, do not do as well in life. And why is that? Because life does not have a single right answer. And the practice of learning how to do well on the SAT or the LSAT teaches you that there is one right answer for every problem. It also suggests that you can prepare for each set of problems simply by going over the old tests, as opposed to opening up your imagination for new challenges. But the most important variable in the University of Michigan study was not, in my view, the financial satisfaction or the career satisfaction, but the fact that there was a relationship between high entry-level credentials and community service, contribution to the community, a negative relationship. So those with the highest entry-level credentials were among those least likely to mentor younger attorneys, to serve on community boards, to do pro bono work, or to lead and assume leadership in their community. So if we are talking about putting the mission of our institutions back into admission, then we need to look to see who is it at the University of Michigan that was actually fulfilling all three elements of the institution's mission: financial satisfaction, career satisfaction, and contribution to the community. And it turned out it was the Black and Latino students who were admitted pursuant to affirmative action. Those were the students most likely to contribute back to the community. They also enjoyed their careers, and they also did well financially. So then you have to step back and say, well, what was it about the Black and Latino students that either predicted they were going to fulfill the institution's mission or inadvertently enabled them to fulfill the institution's mission? Now, on the one hand, I would say predicted, because one of the factors that the University of Michigan Law School was using in the context of affirmative action is that it was looking for people who were leaders. It was not looking for people with the highest SAT or LSAT scores. So if you're looking for people who are leaders, it is more likely you will then graduate people who continue to be leaders. That's the intentional or advertent part. The inadvertent part is that many of the Black and Latino students were engaged or alienated from their law school experience. So they invested enormous emotional energy in outside activities where they learned how to be leaders. And it turned out that was more important in terms of training people for lifelong learning than what it was they were doing in the classroom. Which again suggests to me the idea of the canary in the mines. That we tend to think about the people who are vulnerable and who are not doing as well on our professed standards, such as the LSAT or the SAT, as less qualified. And yet, if we track the canary, we see that it's the atmosphere in the mines that needs to be examined. Let me make that point more clear in the context of the experience of women in law school. And then I want to come back to the relationship between the investment by the states in higher education and the experience of the canaries. So I happened to do a study of the experience of women at the University of Pennsylvania Law School back in the early 1990s. I had a student who basically encouraged me to look at the experience of women because it was her sense that women were not doing as well academically in law school as the men. And she did a study as part of her third-year paper requirements in which she got a 52 or 53% response rate, meaning she surveyed all the students and over half of them responded to her survey. And she found that many of the women never raised their hand in class. So 2/3 of the first-year women said they never volunteered in class. 2/3 of the first-year men said they frequently volunteered in class. 2/3 of the third-year women said they never talked in class, at least not voluntarily. 2/3 of the third-year men said that they often spoke in class. The key finding, however, is that it bothered the first-year women that they were not speaking in class. 2/3 were not speaking. They didn't like that. 2/3 of the third-year women were not speaking in class. It no longer bothered them. They had become socialized to their silence. Which point, Anne and I engaged a sociologist and a professor of education to look at her survey. They encouraged us to go and look beyond the survey to get qualitative data and quantitative data. I also went and talked to my colleagues about the findings, and they encouraged me to look at the LSAT scores of all of the students because they were convinced that the women were somehow disengaged because perhaps we were just admitting the wrong women. So we looked at the LSAT scores, we looked at the undergraduate GPA, and then we also went to the dean and asked him for the academic performance data of the students who were actually at the University of Pennsylvania at that time. Now, this was a new dean. He had just come to the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So he willingly gave us all this data because he figured whatever it said reflected on his predecessor, not on him. So we looked at this data and we found that the women were in fact not performing as well academically. They were not just withdrawing from class, they were not performing as well. The men had 3 times as great a chance of being in the top 10% of their first-year law school class and 1.5 times as great a chance as the women of being in the top 50% of their law school class. And this differential between the men and the women started in first year and was sustained over the 3 years. And then we looked at the LSAT scores and we found, to our surprise, that there was no relationship between the LSAT scores and whoever was doing well or not doing well in law school. Now, it was certainly true that the men had a slightly higher LSAT score than the women on average. But the women had slightly higher undergraduate GPAs than the men on average. But neither the difference in LSAT score, which benefited the men, or the difference in undergraduate GPA, which benefited the women. Neither of those differences was statistically significant. However, I went back to my colleagues. They had suggested, encouraged me to get this data. They immediately seized on the difference in terms of the LSAT. They said, you really need to go and look at the LSAT because it's true on average that you're not seeing anything, but you need to go deeper. And with regard to the undergraduate GPA, they said, well, it must be that the women are majoring in soft humanities, and the men are majoring in hard subjects. And so you can't really tell based on their GPA. I had another colleague who had a different philosophy. He said it had to do with varsity sports. He said, it's true that the men don't have as high a GPA as the women in college, but that's because many of the men are probably engaged in varsity sports, so they're not putting their attention on their studies, but then they get to law school and there are no varsity sports, and so their true brilliance comes through. But I want to tie all of this together because there was an element of truth in my colleague's reference to varsity sports. So I started by talking about performance and participation in class. The men treated law school as a game. And the purpose of playing a game is to win. And the way you win a game in law school is to raise your hand to be the first person to speak. Because when you raise your hand and you are called on first, you get to set the agenda. You also, people at least tolerate your speaking at some length. You haven't quite figured out what it is you want to say, but you've learned how to filibuster, and in some ways you're learning crucial leadership skills, right? How do you hold an audience's attention? The women, by contrast, saw the law school classroom as a learning community. They wanted to say something relevant. So they would wait. When they had an idea, they would start making notes, make a little outline, edit it, wait for somebody else to say something else so that they could raise their hand and build on what so-and-so just said. Unfortunately, the pace of the law school classroom is often very brisk, and by the time a young woman might raise her hand with her brilliantly analyzed and very pithy comments, the class had moved on. Or what she had to say was so concise that people didn't really understand her point. I had a student, in fact, the end of a class, delivered a haiku poem. She had synthesized all of the themes of the preceding hour and a half. Only she and I could understand what she was talking about. Now, I say this because, to me, what's happening with the women in law school is a miner's canary. This is not just about what women are thinking in the context of legal education. It is a critique of the way in which those of us who teach in law school are conducting the Socratic classroom and ostensibly teaching everyone. And why do I say this? Because a young man at Harvard Law School, the son of a feminist, came to the law school as a freshman, came to see me and said he wanted to study what was happening to women in law school. He wanted to do a survey similar to the one I had done at Penn. He engaged his classmates in sitting in the back of their first-year class over the course of 6 weeks, carefully identifying who spoke and for how long in each of these classes. And they found out that 10% of the students were dominating the class. 10% of the students basically occupied almost 50% of the airtime in the classroom. And of that 10%, 80% were men. So you could say, well, this is a gender problem. And the men, as I suggested, were raising their hands. They were what in law school you call the gunners. But when you think about it, it wasn't just that the men were dominating the classroom, it was that 10% of the students were dominating the classroom while everyone else remained virtually silent. And if you look at educational literature, it suggests that people remember most what they themselves have said, and that the way in which you learn is by talking and thinking and actively engaging, not simply by sitting and listening to your classmates pontificate. So, again, looking at the experience of women in law school is the experience of the Canary. My colleagues tended to pathologize the Canary. They said we were admitting the wrong women. But I'm suggesting that the experience of the Canary and tracking that experience can open up a conversation about what we should be doing in the law school classroom to better educate all of our students and to engage all of them in the process of active learning. And especially when you think that the model of the Socratic classroom is based on a litigation model, based on the idea of the professor as judge, asking students questions the way in which a judge might interrogate attorneys at the bench, and yet most lawyers no longer go to court. So that model of preparing lawyers to be litigators is not a 21st century model. So again, this is an opportunity to open up the conversation about what we mean by merit in terms of admission, what we mean by an educational environment in terms of the law school. And finally, I want to come back to the idea of what we mean by the public commitment of our institutions of higher education. And here I'm going to talk again about California and about the fact that California used to have the premier system of higher education in the country. And in 1984, California spent more money on its institutions of higher education than it did on its prisons, for example. By 1994, California was spending the same amount of money on its prisons as on its institutions of higher education. And by 1995, it was spending more money on the prisons than on institutions of higher education. A prison guard in 1995 was making $51,000 a year, and a first-year college professor was making $41,000 a year. And that's just on the surface. For each one of the Latino students who were enrolled in an institution of higher education in California, there were 3 who were in prison. For each black who was in an institution of higher education in California in 1995, there were 5 in prison. So rather than investing in education, we were investing in mass incarceration. And this is another canary in the mines. Because if you are using a system of merit that is actually tracking wealth, and if you are then using affirmative action or diversity as a claim that it is detracting or challenging or departing from merit and stigmatizing affirmative action, and also suggesting to people that the reason, as was suggested to Cheryl Hopwood, that they're not getting into these institutions of higher education has to do with affirmative action, you're creating a very divisive argument that ultimately is not true. Because if you really want to know what's keeping working class and poor whites out of institutions of higher education, it is all the money that is being spent on mass incarceration rather than on building more institutions of higher education. So let me conclude with the positive. So the Canary Watchers in Texas, after seeing what was happening with Cheryl Hopwood, decided that the University of Texas should change the way it was admitting everybody. And they proposed a system in which, rather than having 10% of the high schools dominating the freshman class, they would have anyone in the top 10% of any high school in Texas automatically eligible for admission to the University of Texas in Austin. This was called the 10% Plan. It's not perfect, but it was initiated by a coalition of Black and Latino legislators, professors, and activists who decided that this would be a fairer way of fulfilling the mission of the institution of higher education, which, similar to Sonoma State, was about training a representative group of future leaders and citizens, producing knowledge and contributing to the health of our democracy writ large and of the state of Texas. The Black and Latino legislators put a bill in the hopper. It passed the Texas legislature with the support of Republicans, particularly Republicans representing rural districts. The Black and Latino legislators were able to show these Republican legislators that under the prior regime, which was, quote, meritocratic, in which the SAT was a primary indicator of admissions merit, that under that system, not a single one of a number of these Republican senators' constituents had been admitted to the University of Texas. Because it was not only keeping blacks and Latinos out, it was keeping out poor and working class whites, particularly rural whites. George W. Bush was governor. He signed the bill. It has been in effect now for almost 10 years. 75% of the students at the University of Texas now come in through the 10% plan. Rather than having 150 high schools represented in the freshman class, there are 986 high schools represented in the freshman class at the University of Texas. They still admit some students based on SAT scores. The students who come in based on their 10% eligibility are outperforming the students who come in based on SAT. The students with the highest persistence rates, meaning those who finish freshman year and then come back as sophomores, are black women. The school would not have known any of this, and it would not know any of this if it were not committed to watching the Canaries, to using the experience of the Canary as a diagnostic tool. We see things because they converge around those who are vulnerable. We see them when people are visible, either because they are different in terms of race or gender. But the point of what I call racial literacy or gender literacy is not simply to understand how the system is affecting people of color or women. The point is to use the experience of the Canary to enable all of us collectively to mobilize, as the Black and Latino legislators did in Texas, to change the atmosphere in the minds, and to change the atmosphere in the mind to benefit all of us, so that not only the Canary will thrive, but the minors will as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to take a few questions. Bonnie's going to walk around to the audience with a microphone. Just put your hand up and she'll show up right by you so you can speak up.
This is the second time I've heard you talk about this, and I find it really brilliant and deep. And I also find it really hard to translate it into other situations. I could follow your examples, they make a lot of sense, but I wonder if you or other people here could just run through some more examples so I get some practice in applying how it would actually work.
Do you want to take a couple of questions or just one at a time? Okay.
That's okay. We'll only take 3.
Okay, sure. So, in terms of the idea of the canary in the mines, I think about it all the time. So when, for example, I am in a faculty meeting and am skeptical of a particular candidate who has been presented to my colleagues and me, I'm always stepping back to try to figure out what are the criteria or the structures that are holding the minds together. Not just why is it that I am unhappy with this particular candidate or with this particular decision that is being made. So it's basically an argument for stepping back and understanding structures, not just focusing on individuals to see if they are being victimized or unfairly targeted. And the reason that I talk about this in the context of race or gender is that most often the people that we are likely to think about in individualistic terms are people of color or women. If we have lots and lots of people coming through who look the same and have very similar credentials, we don't tend to stop and question, well, why are they here, or are we holding them to a higher or lower standard? We just examine them on their individual, merit, quote unquote. But in the context of higher education, and particularly in the context of admissions, I have seen lots of institutions thinking this way. Oregon State, for example, uses a program called Merit Aware, in which they now ask all students who apply to answer 6 questions, and I believe you have 100 words or 200 words limit to answer all 6. And the idea is to get people to talk about their own experience in ways that can be easily converted into a set of scores that the university has determined reflect its mission. So leadership scores, experience overcoming adversity, experience with people who are different than you are, but asking all of the students to answer these questions, not just the students of color. So it's the second move is that you're not just applying separate standards to a particular group who are not doing well on your traditional standards, but you're using the fact that there is this disparity to begin to challenge or reconsider your traditional standards. Third, I would say the absence of diversity is a valid critique, but the mere presence of diversity is not the solution.
Another question? No? Here's one. Any more questions? Put your hand up. There's one over here.
He said he has a question.
I'm sorry, I didn't see.
The young man in the gray.
I first want to thank you for a wonderful talk. I happen to be at the University of Michigan, and it was really inspiring to listen to you. We're still sort of feeling very blindsided, and it's a difficult problem. We just went through the graduate student admissions process, and believe me, it's just incredibly demoralizing. I want to ask a question. What you both the question that I had from what you said and then how you answered this question. It sounded to me that you were making an argument really about class and awareness of class and thinking about class as a means of determining eligibility. You didn't use the word class, and I know that that's a bad word to use in our society. We don't like to use it. We don't like to admit that there are classes in our society. And I guess I'm asking, one, did you not use the word class? Was, in the Texas case, was class discussed when this 10% plan, in other words, were people able to come out and say, we need to think about class besides race, and perhaps class would cover a wide range of diverse, eligible people who would do more with their education. So I'd like you to clarify that and talk a little bit about the relationship of class to the answer that you gave to that person, which is stepping back and thinking
About structures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did use the word class. I thought I used it often, actually, so...
You did, but you didn't use it as a criteria for admission. You talked about the difference in the high schools, of course, which is about...
Well, this is the irony, because when we talk about wealthy people, somehow we think we're not talking about class.
Well,
I mean, so I'm saying that is what we are using now.
that's what I wanted to hear you say. Is that
But I'm not saying that we should then just use class differently. I'm saying that there are many ways in which gender, race, and class and geography all interact, and that what we have done is to figure out, as an elite, a way of reproducing ourselves by identifying the people without regard to their gender, race, or geography, who are the most privileged. And those are the people that we then give opportunity to. I am not suggesting that class is a stalking horse for race, or that race is simply a stalking horse for class. I think it's much more complicated. For example, Doug Massey has done some work on high concentration of poverty. If you want to think about this, people who are in the most need of our investment in education, it is those who live in high poverty areas. And the people most likely to live in high density poverty communities are blacks and then Latinos. So it's not just about class, because you can have poor people who are going to great schools and who, as individuals, are getting a lot of attention. So it's really about thinking much more boldly and transformatively about the mission of higher education, and what do institutions like the University of Michigan have to do to fulfill that democratic mission. To step back again, in many ways I feel that University of Michigan, Harvard, all of these, University of Texas, Sonoma State, all of these institutions are trying to basically burnish their reputation based on their selectivity. So that the way in which you establish how good you are is by broadcasting how many people you were able to turn down. First you have to recruit them, then you have to turn them down, right? That's the game. I've been thinking about, and I'm writing a book called Meritocracy Incorporated, and one of the arguments that I'm making is that we've commercialized this idea of merit so that it's a business. But in some ways, I'm having to rethink that metaphor, because when you think about a business, it functions very differently than an institution of higher education. For example, think about a manufacturing business. When you are manufacturing a product, you do not look for the most expensive inputs. You do not look for the way in which you can get the most expensive raw material to bring to your business, and then figure out how you can take credit for having the most expensive inputs. Right? Not the process. The process, right, becomes irrelevant, because basically you've gotten the most expensive raw materials, and so they teach themselves, which is what our institutions do. We say we're getting the best students, and that shows that we're the best institution. We tell you in great detail about our admittees, about our applicants. We can't take any credit for our applicants. We've had nothing to do with them. But those are the people we tell everyone about. The people we can take credit for are our graduates. But we don't tell people about what the median contribution to our society is of our graduates over 10, 15, or 20 years. We will point to some of our stellar graduates. We're very proud of them, but we talk about them in isolation as individuals. We don't say, well, the University of Michigan, Harvard, Sonoma State, of our graduates, 75% are leaders in their community. We don't even know what 75% of our graduates are doing because we don't pay any attention to them except if we want to recruit them to give back to the school as benefactors. So I'm really suggesting a shift, a profound shift in the way in which we think about the process of education and taking the business model seriously and saying we should be looking for inputs in which there is raw talent that has not yet been developed or really harvested. And we are developing the process which is going to be able to not only identify that raw talent, but to bring it to fruition. And that is our output, and then that is what we take credit for. That's a very different model. That's about education, not just selection and recruitment.
I think there's one more question, and then we're going to stop.
Sorry.
I think you're very well spoken, and I feel very, gracious to be here tonight. So my whole question has to do with the whole canary metaphor sense. The canary is supposed to be a symbol for what is in the atmosphere that is creating these issues. But that poison has to come from the source. More on a deeper level, how do we use that canary to get to the source of the issue, the source of what comes into a society that is perpetuated, that creates these issues not only for gender and race, but also those of different sexual orientations and any other minority that might be separated in that issue?
So, I think the first move is to always be attentive to who is feeling excluded. Now, sometimes people are excluded for idiosyncratic reasons, or they feel alienated because they are bringing a set of issues or problems to the circumstance, the shared environment that you don't have any responsibility for. But if there is a group of students consistently over time who are experiencing the atmosphere in a way that's alienating, that's disruptive, I say those are the students, those are the people that you need to be focused on. Those are the canaries in the mine. So, for example, when you think about the fact that for every one Latino student in higher education, there are 3, especially in terms of males, in state penitentiaries. Well, go back to K through 12. You look at who is being pulled out for being disruptive, for not paying attention, who's being sent to special education. That group is not being educated. That's the group I say are the canaries. Those are the people we need to be figuring out how do we better educate them, because if we can better educate them, we can better educate everyone. And all of a sudden now, there's a Newsweek cover story about what's happening to boys in elementary school. And there's not enough gym, or all of the teachers are now women. Or we've spent too much time focusing on what's good for the women, we've been overlooking the boys. Well, that's fine. I think we then look and see, well, why are the boys not doing as well? We shouldn't say, oh, we fixed the problem because the women or the girls are now doing fine. We haven't fixed the problem if, in order for one group to get ahead, another group has to fall behind. So it's not like there's one set of canaries that will service this process indefinitely. On the other hand, having said that, given the role that race has played in this society, and particularly the experience of those who are descendants of slaves, I would suggest that the issue of race, and particularly the issue of race along the axis of descendants of slaves, is such a bias in this society that, unfortunately, it's almost dependable as a source of canaries. And it comes in part, and this is something very few people focus on, we're very proud of our traditions as a society, and we're very proud of our evolution and transformation as a society. But when you look at our Constitution, and you look at the framers, and you look at the first 72 years of our country's history, so this is pre-Civil War, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, during that period, 50 of those years, we had presidents not only from the South, not only from the slave-holding South, but presidents who themselves owned slaves. So for the first 72 years of our country's history, during 50 of those years, we were governed by presidents who owned slaves. Now, the presidents who owned slaves then got to appoint Supreme Court justices who owned slaves. They appointed cabinet officials who owned slaves. These were the people who then wrote the laws that set the precedent on which we now are relying. So you can't talk about Brown versus Board of Education or the Civil Rights Movement and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment as if they alone have fixed this problem. Because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment did not change the way in which we elect senators, for example, to the United States Senate, or members of Congress to the United States Congress. And yet, think about the 3/5 clause. People think, oh, the 3/5 clause, that was a gratuitous insult to African Americans. 3/5 clause said that black slaves were 3/5 of a person. The 3/5 clause was not about insulting anybody. That may have been its effect, but it had a very precise political purpose, and its purpose was to transfer power to the people who owned the 3/5 of the human beings. And the transfer went as follows. When they were doing the population count to determine how to construct a district for the House of Representatives, they would count the slaves as 3/5 of a person. So if you owned slaves and a district was being based on population, that meant that you were basically getting enhancement of population and of a population that could not vote. So it was a way of transferring political power to the owners of the slaves. It was not just insulting the slaves, it was directly benefiting plantation owners who then were able to monopolize or disproportionately enjoy power in the House of Representatives. Now you hear about the Electoral College, which tracks the membership in the House of Representatives as an effort to represent the small states, and of course there was some of that. But the big thing about the Electoral College and the big thing about the House of Representatives was that this was a compromise to protect not only slavery, but to protect the power of those who owned slaves. So when we say that race is now just about diversity and about all kinds of ways that each of us can be different, that's partly true, but we cannot forget that very basic fissure in our society around which our entire political system has been organized. So yes, there are lots of canaries, but no, we're not just using class as a surrogate for race, and particularly not as a surrogate for the experience of those who descended from slaves. Thank you very much.
I just